So having entered the generative linguistic sphere now through semantics, we're going to move down one notch to the theory of syntax. This is the heart of generative linguistics. It's concerned with the ordering of words as they go to make up sentences which are or are not part of a language. Sequences of words don't necessarily mean anything. An appropriate sequence of words, of course, does. Noam Chomsky, to whom we owe most of this concern, famously produced this as an example of a sentence which he claimed was meaningless and yet syntactically valid. That is to say, the sequence of words made this a sentence of the English language, but the words were of a character that the sentence itself was meaningless. Now, let's have a look at the sentence. Colourless green ideas sleep furiously. One could argue against Chomsky about whether or not this sentence is meaningful. Let's take it for now that we accept that this is a sequence of words which is a grammatical English sentence and has been assembled without regard to meaning. What we see is that we have two adjectives followed by a noun, a verb, and an adverb. So the first thing to note is that words belong to classes called parts of speech. You've probably learnt these in school. The main classes, of course, are nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs. And then there's a whole bunch of little grammatical words, some of which are actually quite difficult to apportion to classes. These are called parts of speech. And a noun cannot go where a verb goes, and a verb cannot go where a noun goes, in general. Furthermore, then, words are then combined to form larger units. So ideas is combined with green, giving us green ideas, which is what's called a noun phrase, shown here as NP. And colourless is tacked onto the end, forming a larger noun phrase. So we have a noun phrase nested within a noun phrase. Technically, this is known as recursion, when a structure occurs within an overarching structure which has the same structure. So a sentence within a sentence, or a noun phrase within a noun phrase. It plays a very important role in syntax. The verb sleep is combined with the adverb furiously to produce a verb phrase, and the sentence consists of the sequence of the larger noun phrase and the verb phrase. This is an illustration using a tree-like diagram of the structure of this phrase. So it's called a phrase structure tree. And clearly you can't just swap words around here willy-nilly and still end up with a sentence which would satisfy Chomsky's desire to have an English sentence. So there are regularities which underlie the sequencing of words and which also express the relation of related sentences. So John gave the book to Mary, or John gave Mary the book, for example. There's a principled relationship between those two sentences. And so these rules or regularities are what syntacticians are trying to uncover when they study a language or multiple languages. And we need to be clear that these are not prescriptive rules laid down by some authority. Linguists see themselves as scientists, not as teachers. So when we say there's a rule or a regularity or even a law, we're speaking more like a natural law than a civil law. Yeah. And syntacticians get this all the time, that people mistake them for the grammar police. And they most certainly are not the grammar police. They are trying to study something. So if a scientist sets out to study a planet, the scientist doesn't start off by telling the planet what to do, obviously. The planet will decide what it does, and the scientist's role is to observe and interpret. So it is in this domain here. So the word grammar can be confusing in this respect, because we think of grammar as prescriptive. We often think of grammar as, you probably encountered the term first in school, where a grammar was a set of rules telling you what you should and should not do. That's appropriate in a classroom situation when you're a learner of a language and you want to be told things. It's not an appropriate activity. That's not the sense of grammar in syntax. In the study of the syntax of a language, what one attempts to do is to describe actual use and structure, so it has a scientific agenda. And ideally, the data for this will be actual sentences produced by people, and the goal is to understand and to describe what people do. So don't confuse those two senses of grammar. Prescriptive grammar belongs in school books. Descriptive approaches to grammar is what syntax does. Now, the theory of syntax has undergone, the generative approach to syntax has undergone many changes in the last few decades. It started off with a field known as transformational generative grammar, which attracted a lot of attention, but was gradually modified over the years down to a far less explicit set of rules. So the original formulation had very many rules trying to account for very many phenomena. And over time, the development within the field tended to look for simpler principles underlying the surface level variation. And a more recent version of generative syntax then is known as the principles and parameters approach. And the idea here is very simple. Remember, Chomsky started off by noting that children learn language very, very quickly, as if they were primed and ready to go. And this is a very important observation. It places a great deal of explanatory load on the biological makeup of the child, their inheritance, as it were, and places little weight on the words spoken to the child, on the environment of the child. This is typical when we get to a rationalist sort of perspective. And the idea is that children are born ready to learn language in this sense. They will already have the basic principles of grammar built in, so that they will be inclined to recognize the kind of regularities that will ultimately produce grammatical sentences. Because the principles are built in, and because languages do not vary arbitrarily, the learning task of the child is simplified somewhat now. And so a child born in a Chinese-speaking environment will grow up to speak Chinese. A child born in an English-speaking environment will grow up to speak English, irrespective of the languages of their... it doesn't matter whether the child is Chinese. What matters is what the ambient language is, obviously. So on this view, what the child is doing is not learning everything from scratch. What the child is doing is picking up on cues from the ambient language, which clues them in as to which of a few specific choices are manifest in this language. So the parameters refers to the fact that there's a few discrete alternatives found again and again in languages. So the child is not learning everything, the child is learning which of these few choices is there. Let's have a look at one of these parameters. Oh, before we do, let's just say that the fact that languages are structured according to these principles with only a modest amount of variation in the parameters means it's very, very hard to invent an artificial language. You cannot convincingly invent an artificial language from scratch without a good deal of knowledge of linguistics. There have been many attempts to create artificial languages. Klingon from Star Trek is one. In the film Avatar there was Na'vi. Lord of the Rings featured, and Game of Thrones. All these featured artificial languages which were designed by linguists. Surprisingly enough, a lot of work goes into this these days. Anyway, to return to the parameters, there's some basic principles that the child is assumed to be born with, and now the child is exposed to the ambient language, and one thing it's trying to spot is what's the setting of these parameters. One such parameter is the order of the terms in what we call a simple indicative sentence. And this is really the simplest kind of sentence. John kicked the ball, in which we have a subject, a verb, and an object. John kicked the ball. For some reason, this is taken as being a particularly simple and relevant example. I'm not sure why it's particularly relevant. But all languages can produce sentences of this nature. That's perhaps its guiding role here. And what we find is that a lot of languages will have that order: subject, verb, object. John kicked the ball. SVO, we say, subject, verb, object. But other arrangements of these are possible. And the child's role then is to spot, is this an SVO language or an SOV language or a VSO language? Not all orders are equally common. Subject, verb, object happens to be the most common. But if we go to Irish, for example, we find a different canonical word order in these simple sentences. In Irish, the verb comes first, and then the subject, and then the object. So when John kicked the ball, that means in Irish it will be kicked John the ball. Or in the example given here, it may Aaron eat I bread. So verb first, then subject, then object. Incidentally, one of the reasons that Yoda sounds so strange, you're hopefully familiar with Yoda and his peculiar way of speaking, is that he tends to speak English, but with this particular parameter set to a different value. So much to learn you still have. He's not entirely consistent on this, but in general, the thing that's funny about Yoda's speak is that he's messing with this canonical word order. I think there's some optional reading there in Brightspace if you're interested in Yoda speak. So that's our quick overview of syntax. We had semantics, we had syntax. Next comes morphology, which you may never have heard of. It's not as well known. And in effect, morphology is really a continuation of syntax. It's the syntax within words. It has to do with word formation. Now, words are funny things. We like to think of languages as made up of words, as if words were atoms. But it doesn't work like that in all languages. It's not the way that we think of a word in English doesn't work for very many languages like Chinese or German, for example. Morphology helps us see this. So in morphology, we work with the smallest unit which carries independent meaning. So a single sound like pa doesn't carry any meaning. In English, dog carries a single meaning. It means a dog, obviously. Dogs is also one word, but there's two meaningful bits in dogs. There's dog and there's the plural, s, the plural marker. So that's two morphemes in one word. Doubtful is two morphemes in one word. Doubt can stand on its own, and full doesn't stand on its own, but you find it in combination with other words. So doubtful analyzes into two morphemes despite being one word. Then you find such oddities as cranberry, for example. Now cranberry is two morphemes, and we recognize that because berry is very productive, and we find blackberry, raspberry, mulberry, gooseberry, there's lots of berries. Cran doesn't occur anywhere else though. Cran is a little bit lost here, isn't it? So we call that a bound morpheme. It's a morpheme that only occurs in this particular word formation. Now what we think of as a word has been shaped by our writing practices. In English we use spaces in our writing. We didn't always use spaces. If you go back a couple of hundred years, writing doesn't have spaces. In Chinese, it still doesn't have spaces. In German, different principles of word formation arose, and German morphology is different from English morphology in that it's much more productive. It's fairly easy in German to sling together meaningful bits to make brand new words that have never been seen before or heard, and they will be understood. There's a rather bizarre example there, which I believe occurred once in German jurisprudence. Rindfleischetikettungsüberwachungsaufgabenübertragungsgesetz, which is a law concerned with the transfer of responsibility for monitoring the labeling of beef. You'll be glad to know. You can forget that word now. We could express the same thing in English. No trouble, I just did. But if I wrote that down, there would be lots of spaces. And as you can see, German is parsimonious with spaces. So every language has principles of combining meaningful units. But the thing that we might call a word differs depending on the way that words are built up within a language. So the study of word internal structure has become of interest. And then one question that a psycholinguist might ask, for example, is if you have a big vocabulary, supposing you know lots of words, a lot of those words can occur in different forms. So dog, for example, can occur on its own, or with dogs, and with dog-like and dog-ish. And there's probably a few more words you can make with dog. So does your mental vocabulary, as it were, contain all those variants, or do you piece them together on the fly, assembling words? Those are kinds of questions that a psycholinguist might ask. And we'll wrap up here our little tour of syntax and morphology with an example to show you that science is not entirely dull, and scientists are not entirely lacking a sense of humor. But so I'm going to show you one method used by morphologists to study word internal structure. It's not obvious how you would study word internal structure, so we need methods. And the method here is called expletive infixation. And if you are shocked or distressed by cursing, please stop the video now. You won't miss too much. But if you don't mind, if you're still here, I will carry on and show you. Suppose we have a word like fantastic. Fantastic has 3 syllables. I'm not sure how many morphemes it has. I might like to investigate the structure of this word and find out, for example, are the first 2 syllables a unit to which the third has been added on? Or is the first syllable a unit which was added on to the conjunction of the 2 final ones? In other words, are the gaps between syllables 1 and 2 and the gap between syllable 2 and 3, are they equivalent? Well, one way to do this is to try to put the word fucking in the middle. Fan-fucking-tastic, sounds good. Fantas-fucking-stick, that doesn't work. So by sticking this infix, fucking, into the word, we can show that these 2 positions are not structurally identical. There's no end to how creative scientific methods can be. So we'll finish our tour of syntax and morphology right there and move on to phonology in the next video.